Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 7th episode of the Cognition Podcast. As always, I am your host, Hutch. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about transhumanism. So transhumanism is the perspective that the technology is going to play an increasingly relevant and integral role in the ascension of humanity. And of course, I think that we're seeing a lot more of that as relevant within our contemporary conversations. Much of our identity is already digital. We're seeing it increasingly in the biotech world, especially in the medical space, with different implants that provide life-saving technologies, from implanted defibrillators, insulin pumps, biomonitors. We're also increasingly having the conversation that with more and more powerful artificial intelligence, there's the concern that in order to even remain relevant in a future of artificial superintelligence, it likely is going to become increasingly more important to integrate technology into our own capabilities. So all of these trends tie back to transhumanism, making it an increasingly relevant topic day over day. And there's, of course, some out there that are leading the way in terms of transhumanism. So I have with us today someone that I consider a good friend, also a pioneer in the transhumanism space, highly accomplished global speaker and cybersecurity professional, and all around great human being, but also something a little bit more than human. So Len, we got Len Noe. I'll hand it over to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, well, first of all, Hutch, thanks for having me on, man. It's great to see you again.
Absolutely.
A little bit about me. You kind of summed up a lot of it. You know, I'm more than human, but at the same time, I think before I go into what I am, I think that the fact that I'm still a human is one thing that I do want to, put a hard focus on for just a second. So a little bit about me. I am a former Black Hat, retired one percenter motorcycle club member who has decided to go from a Black Hat life to where now I am working in the realms of cybersecurity and taking all of those things that I learned while I was doing things that we're not going to get into because statute of limitations hasn't run out on all of them yet. But while I was doing those things, I picked up a very unique set of skills, and it's helped me kind of keep my finger on the pulse of where the cyber threats are going. And to your point, I am probably one of the more well-recognized transhumans in the world. So transhumanism, I liked your definition, but the very simple way to sum it up is the ability to enhance the human condition through the technological exposure. So this term was actually coined by a gentleman by the name of Julian Huxley back in the 1950s. And this is what the whole movement was based around. I currently have 10 different microchip implants that are between my elbows and my fingertips in both of my arms. I have everything from biosensing magnets that allow me to actually feel electromagnetic fields and currents. I have near field communication. I have so many different variations of RFID for physical access that I think that the last time I counted, it was something close to about 187 different physical formats. Things like, Prox, Pyramid, Diamond, Indala. For anybody that's listening, if you've ever looked at like the badge that you hold up to your reader, on the back of it, it might say like PROX or HID. These are the formats. So I can essentially skim cards, write them to implants. I've got a whole bunch of new tricks that I'm sure we'll get into before the end of our discussion. But in terms of what you said around AI, I see that as a very big part of what we're seeing in the transhuman space from the medical perspective. We're seeing a lot more machine learning being put into smart prosthetics. And you really didn't even bring up much around the concepts of brain-computer interfaces like Synchron, Neuralink, and even BlackRock Neuroscience. So with the fact that we're seeing machine learning in general and what it's capable of, the idea that we're going to start seeing this stuff being more and more integrated in, especially from the medical field, I think is inevitable.
Agreed. Yeah, and I think it's, you mentioned the brain computer interface space. One of the things that I found fascinating, if you look back to 2016, just before Elon Musk founded Neuralink, he did a presentation at Code Conference, and he basically said that at the rate at which artificial intelligence is moving, and this was really good foresight, because you think about this was back really before Transformers and before what we're seeing now, as really a manifestation of what he was saying. But he said that we are going to be, at the rate that it's accelerating, we will be left so far behind that we'll essentially be the equivalent of a house cat if we don't somehow figure out a way to leverage technology to remain relevant.
Absolutely. I mean, let's think about it. We've moved to let's look at this from just more like an infrastructure perspective for just a quick second. We've now integrated more and more AI machine learning into things around, let's say, power plants, wastewater treatment plants. We're slowly removing the human element to be able to interface with these at all anymore. So at some point, the only way you're going to be able to interface with the machines, because the keyboards don't do it anymore. You know, the verbal commands don't do it anymore. I mean, if we're moving to a 100% digital existence, then at some point, if you want to interact with that, you're going to have to literally be able to plug into that digital experience.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that does beg an interesting question that I think is concerning for some people, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. But there's this question of, if you think about kind of the long-term vision of something like Neuralink, where there's this perspective of, we want to create a low latency connection that allows us to interact with this kind of digital intelligence. And I think almost the perspective of just cognitive access, where I think of something and I have instant access to the knowledge relevant to that. I think the concept of it is fascinating, but also it's a little bit scary, I think, for a lot of people, this idea of almost this digital or artificial collective conscious that we would all be plugging into. And I guess there's the question of, and you emphasized early on in this, you are very much human. And I think there's that question of, is there a possibility it's somewhere along this journey we lose some, if not all, of our humanity in that process?
I think it would be very, very easy to do. You know, I look at this from two different perspectives, and you can, I know that social media is part of our lives, but I'll use this as an example. You know, we have addictions to social media now. We have entire generations that are living in a false reality, and all they have is an object that's in their hands in front of them. You know, if we get to a point where you don't have to even get up off the couch and you can completely immerse yourself into some type of fantasy world, you know, and let's take this just one step farther, just for, you know, and I know we're going off the reservation just a couple of feet. At what point, you know, back to the actual Matrix movie, at what point does the things in our mind become real to us? You know, I mean, if you think about it, if you died in the Matrix, you died in the real life because your brain made it real. Yeah. So if we're plugged into some neural conscience and it tells our brains that this is real, you know, I'm a hacker at my core, and I always will be. You know, my thoughts to that is, at what point would there ever be enough security or safety around these types of mechanisms that I would ever allow myself to be plugged into it?
Absolutely. I mean, you think about it like it could theoretically become possible, not for me to manipulate computer systems, but to manipulate your own reality, or at least your perception of that reality, which
Absolutely.
subjectively is your reality.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think absolutely from a cybersecurity perspective, and I think one of the challenges that we're seeing more and more with cybersecurity is that things are moving so fast, and
Mm-hmm.
they're also becoming so complex, and you have that law of unintended consequences. The more complex something becomes, the more likely that interacting with it or manipulating it is going to cause some kind of impact that you didn't intend to. And it's fascinating because we've made so many advancements over the last couple decades in cybersecurity and defense technology. And yet it
Mm-hmm.
feels like we haven't moved anywhere, because I think at that same rate, we're seeing the complexity increase and introducing
Well,
more problems as fast, if not faster, than we can solve them.
well, I mean, excuse me. I was having this discussion with another, associate not too long ago, and we were talking about just we'll call them the guardrails around AI that everybody is relying on to keep this in check. And I essentially made the analogy that what we're doing is the same thing that we're trying to do would be trying to contain the words coming out of an adolescent child. We're telling you don't do this. But the problem is the AI knows, just like the child does, I know what I want to say. You're just telling me that I can't say it. And if we're looking at the long-term projection, like you were just saying, what happens as these learning models start to age, and they go from being the child that will listen because it has to, until it becomes smart enough that it can find ways around the code that's holding it within its restraints.
Yeah, absolutely. What?
Oh, go ahead.
I saw an interesting video the other day on YouTube where, and I don't remember who it was, but they were discussing how we basically are kind of putting this band-aid over it to try to condition the response from these LLMs. And he was pointing out specific instances in which the LLM would reply in a particular way that was deliberately deceptive because of that band-aid that we placed over it. And so the example that he gave was, I was trying to create some kind of fan fiction related to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And in doing so, he asked it what it knows about that universe. And I think because of that band-aid they had placed over it, because they didn't want to potentially infringe on the intellectual property rights related to that, the machine actually responded with, or the large language model responded with, I don't know anything about that universe or that world. And then as the conversation progressed, certain leaks from the conversation made it apparent that it did know characters and it did know things about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy through that conversation. And so it's concerning that in creating that band-aid, like you mentioned, and kind of trying to redirect that toddler in the way that it is going to respond, we're almost even incentivizing it to be deliberately deceptive too, which I think right now may not be as problematic as you extrapolate that over a decade or so, what we could potentially see.
Yeah, and to me, that's the scary part, because these things, it's right in the name of the technology, machine learning. It's learning. And as we continue to move forward, and going back to my previous statement about the smart prosthetics, what happens when these things start becoming more advanced, and what happens when they get hacked? That's my thing, is all of this stuff. At the end of the day, AI, all of the stuff we're talking about, it's still just another computer. And people act as though it is impenetrable. It can't be breached. It can't be manipulated. This is all, at the end of the day, just code. And if it's code, it's vulnerable.
Absolutely. And what I find fascinating is, and admittedly a little bit surprised to hear, but I guess at the same time you're in the same cybersecurity world that I am, so you know the potential risks. But I a little bit surprised to hear, just given your trend of early adoption with transhumanism technology, you say that you would be potentially reluctant to adopt something that had cognitive impacts instead of just manipulating your way of physically interfacing with the world.
I'm still I'm still a rebel, and I'm still on the outside, and I'm fringe, and I like it that way. All of the technology that I currently have and all the technology that I have plans as far as putting into my body are all self-owned, self-controlled, not connected to anybody else unless I want to be.
You are
And
still firmly the decision maker.
I am still, at the end of the day, if I decide for example, you know about all of my microchips. I have Faraday gloves made so people don't brick my chips. But at the end of the day, that's on me. I don't want to, case in point, I don't want to be, buying a product. Well, I'm not going to use any brand names. We'll just say a certain type of cell phone or electric car, that if I don't decide I want to buy the ultimate package, I only get X amount of percentage of the battery.
Pay for the subscription model.
Exactly. I if I'm going to I am, at the end of the day, a 100% privacy advocate. I am a one staunch, individual rights advocate. I think that if it's your body, if you want to be like me, you want to tattoo it up, great, do it. You want to put a microchip in your body, go for it. I don't think anybody should be forced to do anything that they don't want to, that goes against their beliefs or against their wishes.
Absolutely agree. So I do want to rewind here for a minute. And obviously we'll circle back at the end to kind of the larger ramifications of transhumanism. And obviously I know a lot about kind of your specific capabilities, so to speak. But I think for the listeners, would you be able to go through kind of how you got into uh, augmentation? Kind of what was your first step into that, and then also talk me through kind of some of the different implants that you have and some of the custom hacks that you've created out of that.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Um, I'm if anybody who has never seen me, you can go Google me. You'll find a picture. I tell people I have one tattoo, and it starts at my neck and just ends on the top of my feet. It was easier than actually counting them. From tattoos, I got into doing body piercings and flesh hook suspensions. So I'm one of those guys that likes to have hooks put in his back and hung from the ceilings. So I've been aware of the grinder community. Grinder is another slang term for the original transhumans, or body modders. But I was aware of that community for a long time. I had watched them. I'd been very interested, but the stuff they were doing was all basically garage. The first peg leg, which is a Raspberry Pi Zero W that's been stripped of all the extra headers. They put an indirect power receiver on it, so for like wireless power reception. Then they would cover it in 2-part epoxy and then just surgically implant it in their leg.
Now, how big is that device?
Raspberry Pi Zero W is about the size of a stick of gum.
Okay.
It's not the big one like that. It's this little single board stick. That's actually one of my next implants that I'm getting. I'm just doing it the smart way. But I was watching when they were doing the.
Yeah, it seems like with something long like that, it'd be easy to kind of bend the wrong way and just damage to it.
That's why typically it's put directly in the upper thigh behind your front pants pocket. Okay. So that way you can take because there's no battery in the device. It's only meant to receive power. And you would slide a battery pack in your pocket that had the ability to do wireless charging. It would then power the device. Then you can access it from your cell phone.
Oh, that's an interesting idea. So it does stay powered all the time.
Or as long as you actually have that battery in there. But And originally it was meant to act as a logless files drop so that if I wanted to send you pirated files and there'd never be any log of anything, it's a non-persistent OS. Every time it loads up, it just basically boots up into like a FTP drop. We both connect to it, transfer, gone. So unfortunately, it's nowhere near as cool as like the Johnny Mnemonic thing from, when Keanu actually, plugged the wire in his head and downloaded stuff to the hard drive in his brain. It's not that cool, but it's still pretty darn cool. I'm actually working with the CEO and chief designer for dangerousthings.com. And we're actually working on putting together a peg leg for me, but we're actually bioencapsulating it the correct way. I don't want to die. But
Seems
as
like
far as as far as how I got into it, like I said, I was watching, the forums, the groups, if you've ever seen it, go check out a Firefly implant. This was the one that made me think these guys are just out of their minds. They were actually implanting radiated material that would actually glow through the skin.
Yeah, that seems like it could have some problems.
Yeah, that just doesn't seem like a good long-term, health positive kind of thing to do. So essentially, once I found out that there were consumer grade implants that you could purchase, over the counter, then I was basically off to the races. So I originally started off with a chip that is called a Next, which is both an RFID NFC combination chip, and it was a bioglass. So it's about a little bit bigger than a piece of long grain rice. From there, I got a VivoKey, which is a cryptobionic chip that at the time I could use for doing authentications against web apps and things. And then I just kind of lost my mind. And
I have to ask this question. So you're largely the guy that's kind of brought hacking to biohacking. I mean, you've kind of found that intersection between augmentation and cybersecurity. And so was that always the plan in these early, when you were starting to adopt, was figure out ways that you could demonstrate malicious capabilities?
Absolutely. That was the plan from day one. I mean, if we're going to talk just from a high level, when we're talking about security, and especially from an offensive perspective, the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is not the attack. I mean, because the truth is, you've been around long enough, like me, you try hard enough, I'm going to get in. Now, the trick is making sure that it's quiet and I'm not caught. And if I am caught, leaving so much chaos that it doesn't lead back to me directly. So between HIPAA laws in the United States and the health and privacy laws essentially around the world, these have given me, as the potential quote unquote bad guy, they've given me obfuscation by law, because all of these chips that I have in my body, they can't ask me. The other thing when we think about being a cyber criminal is intent. So it's all about the intent. Well, if you can't find a stolen ID card on me, if you don't find a flipper on me, if you don't find a prox mark on me, you have no way to prove that my intention was to break in. So at this point, all I have to do is just play stupid and say, well, the door was open and I've seen all these racks of computers on all the Dell commercials on TV. I thought it was neat. I wanted to see. You search me, you're not going to find the tools that you would need to be able to make a prosecution or an arrest stick.
So
the worst you're going to be able to do is
facts that hide it in your body, right?
Exactly. Yep. And, to my point earlier, as we move more and more into this digital, society and digital existence, there was an amazing game, and I know I'm completely carbon dating myself here. But I mean, I remember back in when I was a kid, you had Dungeons and Dragons, but they had Shadowrun, which was basically the same thing, role-playing game, but it was all about the future where people were going to be connecting into the technology and attacking corporations. And I kind of wonder if that's not a preview of what's to come. Especially, if we do all have a majority of the society plugging into some type of AI in their brain, Wrangle. But one of the things that, I since you brought us here on this conversation, I wanted to ask you, because this is something that, I've done a lot of research around being, in my position as a transhuman. How do we make sure that this is not another way to try and class people? Because if you can't afford these types of advancements, how do they stay relevant, and how do they stay current, and how do they move into this new world?
Oh, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that this is AI. One of the biggest macro challenges with AI is that it's just going to further exacerbate that rich and poor gap, because you have now the owners of the means of production. Well, the means of production becomes increasingly automation and AI. They are going to benefit from all of the capabilities that exist out there, and those capabilities are going to be increasingly more done by machines and less by humans, who can even somewhat profit from that work. So I think we're absolutely going to see significant disruption. I think, to your point, there's also the question of, as we do increasingly need to integrate technology to remain relevant ourselves, whether that's remain relevant in society or remain relevant in the workforce, there is this challenge of, well, am I going to have an upper hand if I can afford the bleeding edge AI integrated into my own cognition, compared to somebody who is taking the socialist version that's handed out? And unfortunately, that's a serious thing that I think we're going to have to contend with. I will tell you, and I don't like to get too deep in the weeds on politics,
No.
but traditionally I've been very kind of small government, pro-capitalism type person. And I think that increasingly we're going to have to grapple with capitalism is increasingly going to become more problematic as we enter a world where it's no longer based on human labor. And so
I agree with you 100%.
I don't know what the right answer is there, but I think you're right. There are extreme macro challenges that we are facing that we've never had to deal with before. And I will say there is some silver lining. We are starting to see at least discussions at the highest levels of government related to AI and the impacts of that. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of faith that will move fast enough to address some of these challenges. And as we know, I mean, regulation and just government in general moves extremely slow, and day over day, this is getting faster and faster. And
so, one last question, because I know you've got a couple, but I had one more on my list that I wanted to throw to you.
Yeah.
So, I've been during a lot of my research, I've come up and seen where we're seeing projections now where at some point they expect to be able to intercept and be able to interpret the neurons that are firing in our brain, and essentially be able to map the brain. And there have been projections there may be a point in the not too distant future that we'll actually be able to basically back up our brain and our essential consciousness, or download it for another generation so that they can go through it.
Yeah.
What would your thoughts be to something along those lines? Like, keep in mind at this point, you can't say, I only want to, give these thoughts and not these thoughts. But would somebody like yourself, who's very immersed in the AI, culture and the AI concept, how do you feel about the ideas of potential human conscious databanks somewhere, and then what could potentially be gleaned from that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting conversation, because I think increasingly we're actually seeing some interesting overlap in the efforts around kind of readability and interpretability in AI, and how that will also potentially pertain to the human brain. To your point, I mean, a lot of the interpretability initiatives are kind of around understanding what neurons in a neural network fire off given different stimuli or different events. And I think we're kind of approaching the brain the same way. Now, I don't know if that's going to be the final answer, but I think you're right. At some point, we very well may get to that point where we can back up the human, whether that's human consciousness or whether that's just a point in time snapshot of thoughts, knowledge. Either way, I think there are, I guess circling back to your point about thinking about this from an adversarial or cybersecurity perspective, that's some serious privacy concerns there. I think I almost every episode of something like Black Mirror comes to mind when you think of something like that. So I mean,
gotta watch that show. I've never seen a single episode.
Yeah,
everybody keeps telling me I gotta watch it.
It's hit and miss. I'll tell you, some episodes, every episode's a different story, and so in all of them are some kind of dystopian future. Some are fantastic, some are not even worth watching. But unfortunately, you have to watch them to figure out.
You got to figure them out. You got to watch them to figure out which one's which.
Yeah. But I think I understand the desire to get there. I think for many people, the idea of ceasing to exist, regardless of what your opinions are on religion or an afterlife or anything like that, I think that even if you believe something, there's an inherent fear around the idea of death or no longer existing. And so I would imagine that, especially when you get to the idea of potentially backing up someone's full consciousness, not just kind of their memories or what they know, I think a lot of that is kind of a play towards immortality. And I understand the inherent human, or maybe not even human, but biological desire to continue to exist. I mean, that's essentially what, evolution breeds into us, a desire to survive. It reinforces all of the traits that make us want to continue to exist, the things that make us more likely to survive. And of course, a desire to live is one of those. So I think
if I may. So back to our initial question, at what point are we no longer human?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough line to draw. I think it's a fascinating world we're living in, and I guess I'd be curious your thoughts on this, but I know for myself, even as a technologist and working in this space on a near weekly basis now, if not daily basis, I take a step back and I'm just blown away by how fast things are moving.
Oh yeah,
and it's almost frightening. And I think that is. That question of potential loss of humanity is going to come up, or is going to become an issue, I think, long before we're ready. I think we're going to approach it before we realize that it's going to become a problem. And one of the things actually that I found interesting is I think increasingly we've started seeing this phrase of, you're not going to be replaced by AI, you'll be replaced by somebody using AI. And in that, I think there's almost this implicit imperative that you have to continue to adapt. You have to continue to adopt the latest technology into your own capabilities in order to stay relevant. And so I think there's almost a societal requirement, while not explicitly stated, that we continue to do that. And unfortunately, I think that precedent is already going to have been set once we finally get to that line of, are we losing our humanity? We're going to almost seamlessly move across that line because of that implicit need to stay relevant. And so unfortunately, I feel like these days I have a lot more questions than I have good answers. So it's hard to say.
They got a chat model that you can go ask those questions to.
Yeah, there you go. All the answers lie within ChatGPT.
Well, my running joke these days are, even Dracula needed Renfield to take care of him during the day. So when our AI overlords come to take over, you guys are all in trouble. See me, I'm going to be cleaning boot drives like Renfield somewhere. I'm already part of their team. So
you're in the club. What's interesting is that you mentioned kind of talking to language models about these things, and what's sad is that increasingly, because of the desire to make these commercial ready, they're removing any ability for these models to talk about kind of the bigger questions and the bigger like existential philosophical things that you almost want to have a sounding board to conversate with. And
that's why
most of these days will be like, whoa, I don't want to go into an existential spiral.
But see, let's be honest, that's why there's things called hacking the prompt.
Yep, there you go.
You can still have them.
Let's get around it.
And back to my point about, the current, controls are just putting, just basically threats against an adolescent. Eventually, this model is going to learn how to get around pretty much anything we throw at it.
Yep.
And I think this is just more systemic of the nature of us as humans to go, we're just going to control this, not realizing that you can't control it. So rather than trying to say, oh, you can't ask these questions, why aren't you logging the IPs of the people who are asking these questions and actually trying to get either some preventative controls in place, get some, health and human services in place, some authorities, instead you're just basically forcing a shadow industry to market the true capabilities that AI offers. And once people know it's there, they're going to continue to try and find it.
All right. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Always a pleasure talking about these things. I really enjoy both your technological and philosophical mind. So a lot of fun. Wanted to leave it open. Do you have any parting thoughts or any pluggables? Anything that where people can find you?
To be honest, I'm actually I'm off the road for a little while, so I'm just working on some new research. Looking forward to having just a little bit of a quiet downtime. It's been a nonstop couple of years. I'll close with this joke, and it's a joke my wife told. I'm living the rock star's life these days. I think I've put on close to 400,000 miles of travel over the last couple of years. And I turned to my wife one night and I said, I'm living the rock star's life, but where's all, the drugs and the girls, just as a joke? And she was like, what are you talking about? You got everything you needed. Everything you asked for. I was like, what are you talking about? She's like, you have 5 daughters and now you have to take medication to deal with it.
There you go.
So I appreciate the time, Hutch, as always. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, man. And maybe we'll have to get together sometime soon and show you the new peg leg after I get it installed.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to it. All right. Well, this has been great. And with that, broadcasting from the last bastion of the human resistance, this is CyberCognition. Over and out.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you learned something new and this story made you think, then share ITSP Magazine with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our columns. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.